Morning, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, morning.
How are you?
Good.
It's good to see everybody again. And we'll have more coming as we get their kids in Sabbath school. And I appreciate the early birds showing up. I mentioned something about Leon last week. Leon is doing much better. Still don't know what's wrong with him, but he's better. Pain subsided, and I'm hoping he continues to stay on that path of recovery. A couple of weeks ago, I had a lesson here, and I felt like it was a complete disaster. I felt like I never got going teaching that lesson. And but one thing I wanted to emphasize was this book, Stop Worrying and Start Living. And the response I've had makes me feel better about the effort that I made. Because people are reading it, people are asking for the lesson. And I'm telling you, if you know someone who has some issues, this helps. This is a good deal.
Where is that available?
Barnes and Noble, Amazon online. Easy to get. Well, not easy.
We had to in the case, and we bought both of them.
Yeah.
Abner will be through that one probably on 6 or 8 months. You can have it.
I've got another one at home. I'll be finished with it by next Sabbath. I'll bring it to you.
They're not easy to get at McKay's because McKay's is very well traveled and the books don't, some folks don't pass there, but you can get them at Barnes and Noble. So you can get them online. Anyway, I appreciate Doug picking up the baton and moving forward. This is in a way a very another dark lesson, but about David, but in a way it will show some justification as Doug gets through it about where David is heading. And Mark, anything new on the back of the room there?
No, was that Sabbath that you taught, was that when the chairs were all turned this way?
Yeah.
Okay, so that one is outstanding. So that's why people remember this book. See, it was.
Oh, well, good. Because they couldn't see my face in the back of the book. Okay, listen, with that said, Marlene, would you have our prayer this morning so we could we'll get going here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this Sabbath day. We thank you, Father, also that technology has enabled us to continue to gather, to continue to worship you, Father, and learn from your word. We ask the presence of your Holy Spirit on all of us, with all of us, and especially with Doug as he leads us this morning. Thank you for your love and mercies, Father. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good to see you. I am working at sharing my screen with you. And Abner, I may need a little bit of help from you. So give me just a second here.
Should be at the top.
Yeah, here we go. Let's see if I go like this. There we go. Okay. So there's, if I go share.
Yeah, you got it.
Good. Okay. So that's the first step because there's another couple steps. And I think I accidentally closed the screen that I wanted to share with you after this one. So we'll see what happens. If so, we'll just bumble our way along. We're in 2 Samuel 20. And I have titled this lesson, Good News, Bad News. I hope that the reason for that becomes clearer as we go along. I didn't want to just make this a clever approach to what could be some very gory stories. I hope that you'll see that there's more than just a clever good news, bad news sort of a meme here. Although I am going to start off with a couple of memes And let me show this one to you here. Okay. You probably all have your own favorite good news, bad news. Sometimes the good news, bad news comes in the form of, do you want to hear the good news first? Do you want to hear the bad news first? That's what this one is. You want to hear the good news first or the bad news first? The doctor says. Oh, the good news, please, doctor. Well, they're naming a disease after you. So you may all have your own favorite good news, bad news memes or stories. Let me take a moment to hear one or two of them. Anybody good news, bad news?
Oh, sorry.
Nobody?
Back over there.
Okay.
So on the airplane, the airline pilot says, "May I have your attention, please? This is your pilot speaking. I do have some good news and I have some bad news. The bad news is we've lost all engine power and we're going to crash. And the good news is we're 15 minutes ahead of schedule."
Okay, there you go. There's the good news, bad news. Anybody else? One or two others?
Oh, God, I would say good news was when we came up last March to New Hampshire to be in the neighborhood of our daughter. The bad news is it's taken over a year and we're still not back home.
Yeah, there you go. Good news, bad news. Anybody else?
Gordon here.
Yes,
Just
Gordon.
a church-related issue here. The good news is we've started on the addition. The bad news is it keeps raining.
Okay, there
So
you go.
progress is very slow.
Okay. Anybody else? One more. Good news, bad news. Yes, please, John.
Okay. I bought a farm and told one of the people I work with I'd sell 5 acres or so of it to her. Well, I could go to her and say, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I'm going to sell the farm and I'm going to make $100,000 off of it. The bad news is you won't get your 5 acres.
And he says, "What?"
The bad news is you won't get your 5 acres.
Yeah. Okay, so one more, Ken. Ken.
I have wondered about a fellow I graduated from college with over 50 years ago. What happened to him? He was a nice guy. And I'd heard that this and that. And so I finally located him a couple of weeks ago. He sent me a text. I sent him back. And the good news was it was really good to hear from him. The bad news was he said, "Let me send you a picture of my big home. Let me send you a picture of my big new boat. Let me send you a picture of all my stuff." That was the bad news.
Yeah, that is bad news. Yeah. Oh, here, Marlene put one on the chat. Let me read that to you here. Bad news, COVID. Good news, we are still gathering. Yeah, yeah, good. By the way, in the chat also, you'll see the name of the book that Ken recommended and that he held up a moment ago. It's in the chat there for those of you who have not noticed it yet.
Big hotel there.
Okay, so I invited you to consider an individual that some of you may never have heard of before, and his name is Aron Ralston. Let me just by a show of hands see how many of you had heard of Aron Ralston before. Anybody heard of Aron Ralston before? John, you had. And maybe some of you didn't recognize the name, but you recognize this from a news story back from 2003. You know, it's coming on 20 years now. So I'm curious, did anybody click on that link and learn a little bit about Aron Ralston? Anybody? You did? You did? Okay. I was actually going to show you the 4-minute video, and I had it queued up, and then in messing around, I lost it. And I could take a moment to find it, but maybe instead of doing that, what I'll do is I'll just tell you real quickly. You might want to click on that link later and look at it. Aron Ralston is now a motivational speaker. What made him famous was that he's the man who cut his own arm off. And in 2003, April 26, he was climbing alone in a canyon, and during a fall down I would call it a crevasse, except it wasn't ice, but it was like a crevasse. As he reached up to hold himself, an 800-pound boulder came down and wedged in that small space, entrapping him and crushing his hand. And he hung there for 6 days trying to decide how to get out. And he tried everything. It's a dramatic story. In fact, a movie has been made of this called 127 Hours, because that's how many hours he was there. And finally, with a very weak, dull pocket knife, he managed to cut his own arm off and save himself and walk out alive. Now that's the dramatic story. And if you click on that link, the 4-minute link that I included there, I think that you'll be inspired. But he has gone on to use that experience. He's an engineer. He designed his own prosthetic device, and it's an inspiring story about him, and you might enjoy clicking on that. Now, those of you who are already clicking on and watching it and reading about him during the lesson, you're going to miss all the rest of the lesson. So I guess that's just the risk I take with not showing the video to you right now. But here's my question. April 26, 2003. Somebody looking at him and knowing what's about to happen in the next 6 days. What's the good news, bad news for Aron Ralston?
Good news is you're gonna live.
Bad news?
You're gonna live without your arm.
If he was right-handed or left-handed, I guess.
Yeah. Now, what if you switch that? Or yes, Gordon.
Well, isn't he really a good example of what the Bible talks about? How trials and tribulations really are meant to teach us. We're supposed to learn.
Yeah.
Apparently he did.
He did. And if you watch even that 4-minute video of him speaking, you will see that. Yeah. So let me flip it around. We talked about good news, bad news on April 26, 2003. What is the bad news, good news? Just flip it around. What's the bad news, good news? This is not a trick question.
He lost his arm.
Yeah, that's the bad news. You're going to leave here without an arm. And if that's the only thing you focused on, that's horrible news. You're going to leave here without your arm. Good news is you're going to live. And just the order in which you say it says something about your focus. Good news, you're going to live. Bad news, you're going to live without your arm. Bad news, you're going to walk out here without an arm. Good news is you're going to live. Now, that becomes important in our story today, because on first surface reading, many of us, particularly from a more sanitized, civilized, genteel Western society, we read the story of a guy wallowing in his own blood and his intestines spilling out, and all the army stopping to look at him. And finally, he's dragged off the road so the army can keep moving. And we say, that's gross. Why in the world is that story in the Bible? We read a story about a guy being decapitated. His head is cut off, and his head is tossed over the city wall to stop the battle. And we say, why in the world is that story in the Bible? That is gross. Who needs that detail? Too much information. Thank you very much. And from our perspective, those stories seem so bloody, so gross, and all we can see is either bad news or just kind of irrelevant, too much information news, and we say, why is that in the Bible? And if we look a little bit deeper and go beyond the blood and guts and gore, we say, okay, this is a really sad way to end the story of the life of David. And make no mistake, there really is a sense in which this is the ending of the story of David. Now, it's true that we're going to have several more chapters, but those several more chapters are out of chronological order, and they're really the epilogue. And we'll come back to that. That's our study for next week. But there's a sense in which the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which you remember, are one long story. The only reason we have them divided into two is that the scroll was too big and it was cut after the death of Saul. But it's really one long story in two scrolls, and it survived that way in our Bibles today as 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, but it's one long story. And as we've been saying right along, there's really two main characters, two main human characters. It's Saul and David. And Saul and David are the first two kings of Israel. And what we're looking at is this experiment known as the monarchy. And it's basically a failure. Saul has this great promising rise to power and then a tragic decline and fall. And sadly, David does the same thing. David has this rise to power and then a tragic fall and decline, and it ends really on a quite bad, sad note. But the way we're going to look at it today with this sort of final chapter, if you please, before the epilogue, 2 Samuel chapter 20 is really the ending of this long story that we've been studying now for quite some time of 1st and 2nd Samuel, all one story. And the story ends today with a good news, bad news theme. And as it ends with this downward fall of David's kingdom, much like Saul's kingdom had a downward fall. And we're going to look at it from a good news, bad news, not a bad news, good news. So we're going to look at the good news first, and then we're going to look at the bad news. And I'm going to share my screen again and show you. Okay, let's go beyond these memes. Okay, show you the good news and the bad news, but let's just look at the good news first. From David's perspective, there is good news here. Open your Bibles to the chapter we're studying today, 2 Samuel, chapter 20. And this is titled, Sheba Rebels Against David. Now you remember, we have just finished several chapters of Absalom's rebellion against David. And notice what is really a key verse here in verse 6, 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 6. David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba the son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us." So Joab's men and the Keithites and the Pelethites and all the mighty warriors went out under the command of Abishai. They marched out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. That's a key passage in this chapter. Let me read the first part again. David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom did." Just let that soak in for a second. We have just finished a tragic story of all the harm that Absalom did, brewing his rebellion for some 10 years. And now comes in this guy that we've never heard of before, and he's about to try the same thing to take over the kingdom. And David sees more clear-eyed than perhaps he has in the past. And he says, we've got to nip this in the bud, unlike what he did with Absalom. He said, we've got to nip this in the bud, because if we don't, the harm from this will be worse than the harm that came from Absalom. Now just let that soak in for a second, because here's another part of this story. Obviously, the harm that came from Absalom traces back to David's failure, his murder of Uriah, his sexual scandal with Bathsheba. And so what we're seeing signaled here is David beginning to get a bit of a bigger picture. David has taken 10 years since Uriah and Bathsheba to get here, but he's getting a bit of a bigger picture. And last week was an opportunity to look at some of that bigger picture. And John, I've not gone to the archives yet to read your lesson, but I know from the comments that I've heard from 2 or 3 people who have reached out to me and told me what a good lesson it was. I am just really thrilled. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you did. And I'm looking forward to listening to it. And we began to look at this matter of integrity and people in the story of the return to Jerusalem who are displaying integrity. And along with that, we begin to see this bigger picture that David is waking up to the fact that God is doing something bigger. And his comment here, he said, if we don't act really quickly on this, if we don't do something about this, then what we're facing is potentially worse than even what we were facing with Absalom. That's a key in understanding this chapter. So let that sink in for just a moment. And I'm going to move forward fairly quickly now, because there's a lot of details here. We're not going to spend time at looking at them all. I want to see big picture. And the big picture is that there's good news here. And we want to take a chance to look at that good news. There's also some bad news, and we want to look at that too. And we want to see what God is saying to us as we wrap up this story of how God was working in the nation of Israel for their good in spite of their terrible mistakes. Just like he was working in Saul's life in spite of his mistakes, how he was working in David's life in spite of his mistakes, how he was working for the whole nation. And if you stop and think about it, our experience with God really is oftentimes a good news, bad news. The bad news, we make some horrible mistakes. The good news is God can salvage those mistakes, et cetera, et cetera. And so the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel is really a good news, bad news sort of a theme anyway. Let's take a look at the good news of this chapter. And so I'll put the first one here, and that is, good news, David, your family survived. And let's take a look at that here in chapter 20, verse 1. I'm sorry, not verse 1. We'll come back to verse 1. Let's go to verse 3. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem. Now, all that we had in the chapter before was the story of his return. Now he's returning. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows. Now, part of this we're going to explore when we do look at the bad news. But let me just focus on the good news for right now. And that is, when David gets back to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not destroyed. There was no battle there. Instead, the battle took place away from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is still intact. His family that escaped with him survived, and his family, the 10 concubines that remained in Jerusalem, survived. He has come out of this experience with Absalom with his whole family intact, as intact as the family was. As you remember, there's been much decimation of this family over the last 10 years. But at the point of the rebellion and the intactness of his family at the point of the rebellion, his family's still intact. And that's good news. There's good news. David, your family survived this thing. Not a one of those children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, uncles, aunts, all of these people that escaped with you across the Jordan are coming back with you to Jerusalem. And all of those people that you left in Jerusalem, they survived too. That's good news. Your family survived. So I want you to just pause on that for a moment. We're not going to pause there long, but I gave you in the outline, I gave you some passages to read there about this, about the leaving Jerusalem, about the coming back to Jerusalem, about the crossing of Jordan. We're not going to take a lot of time on that because there's other things I really want us to get onto. But before we move off of this piece of good news, any comments, any questions about this aspect of David's family surviving? I want to give you an opportunity if you want to make any comments or ask any questions about that. Anybody? Going once, going twice. Okay, let's move on. So there's another piece of good news. Now this one may be harder to see because we have to hold our nose a little bit to read the story. But there is a piece of good news in this. Your tribe will advance your interest at any cost. And that's the next story. And let's drop into it here. We've got this threat from Sheba, the son of Bikra. And we haven't heard of him, but we have heard of some of these other characters. And I want you to see that here as we look at this in verse 8. Let's come to verse 8. While they were at the great rock in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Joab was wearing his military tunic, and strapped over it at his waist was a belt with a dagger in his sheath. As he stepped forward, it dropped out of his sheath. Now, this is almost like describing a movie to somebody who hasn't seen the movie, and you're telling them the relevant things that are going to build up to the plot. And these little details are all building to something that's going to be quite dramatic. But let's pause for just a moment and remind ourselves who these characters are. We have Amasa, who is from the tribe of Judah and part of David's family. And we have Joab, who is also a relative of David. In fact, his nephew, his sister's son. And Joab has a colorful history, and we have encountered him many times in his loyalty to David. But we've also noticed that his loyalty to David also seems to have a self-seeking interest to it. And so when we say your tribe will advance your interest at any cost, we might put in parentheses, your tribe will advance your interest and their own at any cost. And there's a real mixture of motives here. We've certainly seen that all along with Joab. We've seen it with his brother Abishai, and of course their brother. There were three brothers. Ahithophel was murdered by another cousin Abner, and we'll come back to that in a moment here. But these are who these characters are. Now Amasa, oddly enough, you might remember, had been the commander of the rebellion armies, that is Absalom's armies. And after the rebellion is put down, David makes him, Amasa, the commander of his own armies. This is an odd situation here. Civil war, and the losing side, the general, now becomes the general of the winning side. Well, Joab had been the general, and you can see why he might do what he's about to do. So going back to verse 8. While they were at the great rock in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Joab was wearing his military tunic, and strapped over it at his waist was a belt with a dagger in its sheath. As he stepped forward, he dropped it out of its sheath. Joab said to Amasa, "How are you, my brother?" Then Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. And this is a standard greeting. This is not anything weird. This is the standard greeting you think of even the Italian greeting today, kissing on both cheeks sort of a thing. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand. And Joab plunged it into his belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. Then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. Now, again, we're not going to go into great detail on this, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there's just something that you need to grapple with in order to move on with the story. But I want you to get the big picture here. Joab has been David's general through thick and thin. And while he has been a hothead and has made a lot of mistakes, he's also been incredibly loyal to David. And we might say that loyalty to David has very likely been a self-serving loyalty at times. But he's spoken David pretty sharply, telling him to snap out of it, telling him to get with it. He's helped bring about reconciliation at times when reconciliation needed to happen. Joab is a colorful character. He's a real mixed bag. And he's a violent man. And here what appears to be mixed motives of both loyalty to David and getting rid of this Amasa guy and serving his own interest to get back in charge of the army. He murders one of his relatives in cold blood while pretending to kiss him. And some have seen in this the kiss of Judas of Jesus, and very possibly, but I don't want to go down that path. But on the surface, if we're just looking at the good news, and let's just stick with the good news for right now, we say, look, David, your tribe will advance your interests at all cost. You got to be grateful for a family, for a tribe that is looking out for you and is making sure that you get some help from them. They've got your back. And what we see as this story continues, and we'll keep reading here in a minute, is that this is really a almost a distraction, if you want to give it that trivialized picture, on the way to the big battle. And so he gets Amasa out of the way, and if you read the story earlier, and we can come back to that in a moment, Amasa has not done what David asked him to do in being quick about getting this rebellion down. He said, here's your deadline, and Amasa didn't meet that deadline. And Joab is saying, I'm going to take charge of the thing. I'm going to make sure this thing happens, and we're going to take care of this rebellion. We're going to take care of Sheba, son of Bichri. And in the process, he assassinates, he kills his rival, Amasa, who has also let David down. So there's a lot of complexity there, but let's stick with the good news right now. We're saying, David, good news. Your family survived Absalom's rebellion. David, good news. Your tribe will advance your interest at any cost. Now, I know there's some bad news on the heels of this, and it's almost blaring. It's like the elephant in the room, but let's just hold that for a minute. Do you see some good news here for David in Joab's willingness at all cost to make sure that David and his kingdom are protected? Comments, questions about this piece of good news for David? Any questions, comments?
Doug?
Roy, please.
The question I would have is that why would he ask Amasa to do this if he was on Absalom's side? It seems like putting him in charge of the army would be a downfall.
I know.
Putting him at danger.
I know. I have scratched my head about that. And I'll have to admit, Roy, I don't really have a good answer. The only possible answer I can think of is that David is working for reunification. And he says, Amasa, even though you foolishly chose to support my rebellious son, Absalom, all is forgiven, and I'm putting you in charge of my army. And I think there's probably more to it than that. It's probably far more complex, but the Bible doesn't go into any explanation. And so I have to leave it with my own conjecture But that's been the only thing that I've been able to come up with so far. Any other comments or questions? Yes, John, please.
In preparing for the lesson last week, I mean, I concluded after reading quite a bit that that was a political move. That David, there was, you just all of a sudden don't change leadership and 100% people fall over on the other side. That doesn't happen. There's a reason why a significant number of people followed Absalom, and they just didn't change on a dime.
Yep.
Yeah. David was pretty smart politically. This is not his first time at giving responsibility or assigning somebody something for strictly political reasons.
Yep.
And that's what this was, particularly in that this, in putting this position in place, if it was a mistake, and it was going to be a mistake, I mean, David said, okay, go do this, and you have 3 days. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but David's thinking in the back of his mind, I gave him his position. Absalom followers, hopefully politically, will fall on my side. I gave him 3 days. You know,
Yeah.
he ain't going to do it.
Yeah, that could be. I hadn't thought about that, John.
He
Yeah.
ain't going to do it. And so, and I got Joab here to clean up the mess. You know,
You know, there could be. Yeah, I think that's a very helpful insight. And it is, again, this story is complex. David is complex. The people around him are complex. Marlene has a comment here. She says, it's very hard to know that a bloody incident is good news. You're right, Marlene. I don't want to be trite and cavalier about that. Very true. And yet, even if we go back to the death of Absalom, you know, there's good news, bad news there. The good news is the rebellion is done. The bad news is your son is dead. Yeah, it's hard. It's tough. And let's hold that thought a little bit, because I want to come to the bad news. We're actually going to spend a bit of time on the bad news, and then where we're going, we're not going to end there. We're going to look at, okay, so what's the better news? What's the best news in this big story? And then we want to apply it to ourselves. And we've only got half an hour left, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. Let me share my screen with you again, and let's come back to the, let's see here. I have to get out of my screen sharing in order to go to chat. Abner, I'm sorry. Is there another chat here I need to look at?
No.
Okay, good.
That was me letting you know.
Okay. So let's go to one third item of good news to David. Oops, why is this not working? There we go. Okay, so good news, David. Your family survived. Your tribe will advance your interests at any cost, and your kingdom is secure from treasonous takeovers. Now, we're going to read this part fairly quickly, and again, it's complex. There's a lot of detail here, but let's go for the big picture. So at the family level, his family survived. At the little bit larger tribe level, his tribe, Judah, is sticking with him. Now remember, that's kind of the essence of this thing, because now we're going to go back to the beginning of the chapter 20, verse 1, and we're going to see that Sheba is from the tribe of Benjamin. Anybody? What bells does this ring from you, the fact that Sheba is from the tribe of Benjamin? Why is that significant?
Same tribe as Saul.
Same tribe as Saul. So really, this is same song, next stanza. We got the Saul David thing, the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Judah thing. There's tribal feuding going on here. And Sheba is from the Saul of David, from the Saul of Saul. Let me say it again, from the tribe of Saul. And that's significant. He is trying to raise up those old feelings of David really doesn't belong on the throne. It should be somebody from the tribe of Benjamin, because that would be continuing with Saul's mind. That's what this is all about in terms of politics. So let's read that story. We'll probably read parts of it, maybe not all of it. But at the end, there's good news for David, because his kingdom is secure from treasonous takeovers. Let's go back to chapter 20, verse 1. Now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. Now happened to be where? Well, that's the end of chapter 19, which we studied last week. And what you might remember is after David returns to Jerusalem, all of Israel, all 12 tribes, the 10 tribes that consider themselves to be part of Israel, and the 2 tribes that consider themselves to be aligned more with Judah. And sorry if that's confusing, but you've got still a bit of tribalism within a united kingdom. They start squabbling among themselves, and it breaks down into a tribal feud over who really has greater loyalty, greater ownership in David. And in the middle of that, this guy Sheba stands up and he says, forget all of this. I'm going to take over the kingdom. And if you like what I'm doing and you want to be with my tribe, come with me. That's what happens here. Now, a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, we have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, O Israel. So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba. So what we have is another civil war brewing here. They deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from Jordan to Jerusalem. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, and we read this earlier, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows. Then the king said to Amasa, this is what John was referring to a moment ago. Then the king said to Amasa, summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days and be here yourself. But when Amasa went to summon Judah, he took longer than the time the king had set for him. David said to Abishai, and we read this earlier, how Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us. And so we have now the story of then Amasa and Joab, and we drop it down to the battle against Sheba in verse 14. So come down to verse 14. Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel Beth-maacah, and through the entire region of the Berites, who gathered together and followed him. All the troops with Joab came and besieged Sheba in Abel Beth-maacah. They built a siege ramp up to the city, and it stood against the outer fortifications. While they were battering the wall to bring it down, a wise woman called from the city, listen, tell Joab to come here so I can speak to him. He went toward her, and she asked, are you Joab? I am, he answered. She said, listen to what your servant has to say. I'm listening, he said. She continued, long ago, they used to say, get your answer at Abel, and that settled it. We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why do you want to swallow the Lord's inheritance? Far be it from me, Joab replied. Far be it from me to swallow up or destroy. That is not the case. A man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Hand over this one man, and I'll withdraw from the city. The woman said to Joab, his head will be thrown to you from the wall. Then the woman went to all the people with her wise advice, and they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. So he sounded the trumpet, and his men dispersed from the city, each returning to his home, and Joab went back to the king in Jerusalem. There's a sense in which, and remember how I started with our introduction, this is really the end of the story of David. And it ends on a grisly note, not that different than the grisly note it starts on, with David cutting off Goliath's head. And you might have noticed in the outline that I noted that the enemies of David often end up without their heads. And I cited in there Goliath, Ishbosheth, Shimei, except he got his averted, Sheba, Ahithophel, Absalom. There's a sense in which a theme through the book of Samuel is that you oppose David, God's anointed, and you lose your head. And it ends on this theme like it started with Goliath. And the bigger theme is your kingdom, David, is secure from treasonous takeovers. Even this guy Sheba, who poses a worse threat than Goliath did, a worse threat than Absalom very recently did, he loses his head too. Now, again, our sensibilities are somewhat jarred by that. But there is a picture here of good news to David, like with the story of Goliath. Your enemies lose their head. Your enemies are vanquished, and your kingdom is secure. And the book, except for the epilogue we're about to study next week, the book ends here with the securing of David's kingdom. And like his enemies all through the story, Sheba loses his head too. And then the last little paragraph here is kind of a reinforcement of the security of David's kingdom. Joab was over over Israel's entire army. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Eliahud, was recorder. Sheba was secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priest. And Ira the Jerite was David's priest. And what we have is a conclusion to the story of David's kingdom, showing that his family has survived, his tribal advanced his interest, and his kingdom is secure. That's the good news. But the story also has bad news to it. And we're going to turn to the bad news, but I'm also going to give you a chance to ask any questions or make any comments about the good news section that we've looked at. And I want to quickly get onto the bad news and then onto the better news and to the application to us. But any questions about these three pieces of good news regarding his family, his tribe, and his kingdom?
Gordon, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, Gordon here.
Hi, Gordon.
It just seems to me that this whole thing is a good news in the sense that it is ensuring that David's son is going to build the temple.
Yeah, it does have that buildup. Yeah, that's a good point, Gordon. Anybody else?
Doug,
Yes.
this is Ruth.
Hi, Ruth.
I just want to throw this in, and I don't mean to be sacrilegious, but what we just read about Judah and Israel, and then Sheba coming with a third party, I hope is not prophetic of what we're seeing in the United States with the Democrats, Republicans, and a possible third party, the Patriots.
Yeah, oh, wow. Yeah, I'm not even going to bite at that, Ruth, but yes, it does make one ask questions about current application if there's any shadows. Thank you, Ruth. Anybody else?
Can you hear me okay, Doug?
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
All right. 2 Samuel 17, verse 25. Absalom made Amasa captain of the army instead of Joab. This Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jethro, an Israelite who had gone to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So this was Joab's cousin.
Yep, it's all a family.
Now, since he had joined with Absalom and he was the leader of the troops, he, of all the people in the nation, could keep the rebellion alive. That's one reason David made him captain instead of Joab. Another reason is because of the way Joab talked to him and of the way that Joab killed Abner and the way he killed Absalom whenever David told him not to.
Yep. Good point. Thank you. And yes, there is so much detail given here. Many details left out, obviously, but so much detail that we can drill down and find some of these nuances, which are quite fascinating, and I think reinforce the big points that we're looking at. I'm going to move forward unless I missed a hand. Did I miss anybody? Okay, let's go to the bad news. And there's a sense in which I think that we need to really allow this to sink in. Because just as we don't really appreciate the good news of God's forgiveness for us until we accept the bad news of how much we need it, there's a sense in which we can't really appreciate the better news that we're about to look at until we let some of this bad news sink in. And yes, there's good news for David. In the moment, his family is saved, his tribe is loyal, his kingdom is secure. But there's bad news too. So there's good news. Yes, your family survived. But the bad news is your family, your surviving family faces living death. And now let's come back to that passage in the beginning here in chapter 20 and verse 3. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. Now here's the key verse. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows. Now that's not just a passing comment. This whole book is structured so carefully with the details showing the theological big picture that the author is intentionally calling our attention to this fact that these 10 concubines live the rest of their lives a living death. They live as widows. And they are confined. They have no more role. And we could spend the entire lesson on this, but let me summarize real briefly this way. They are characterizing David's family, David's immediate family, his household, from here on out. And I gave you some passages to look at here in the outline, and I'm not going to take time to read them right now. But this idea that a living death is what follows David's family from now on out is a fulfillment of Nathan's rebuke of David after the Uriah Bathsheba incident, where he says, the sword will never depart from your house. This is a fulfillment of that. Yes, your house will survive, but it will have a sword hanging over it always. The sword will never depart from your family. And here that same truth is told in the wrapping up of this story as it tells about David's family, David's tribe, and David's kingdom. And the only glimpse we get of his family are, yes, his family survived, and these 10 concubines who are then sequestered almost like under house arrest. And there's reason for that, and there's both humane reasons and punishment reasons, and I won't get into that right now, because there's a lot of cultural things tied up with that, historical cultural thing. But the picture that the author is painting for us here is that David's house is suffering a living death. Yes, they go on, and for the rest of their life, they are living shackled. They are living bound up. And they do not experience the freedom and the joy and the life that they would have experienced had it not been for the Bathsheba Uriah incident. And these 10 imprisoned concubines, yes, David's family survives, and from now on, his family, as Nathan predicted, is living under the sword. Now, I could get into more detail, but because there's a lot more material that I want to cover in the next 15 minutes, I won't go into detail on that. But any comments or questions? I want to take time, if you have some comments or questions, just a moment or two on that before I go on to the other two pieces of bad news. Anybody?
So, Doug?
Yeah.
From reading all of these stories, it is evident that all of us are going to die sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
And as we walk through life, we have to decide on which side we're on.
Yeah.
And that's what all these people are doing.
Yeah.
Even if we made mistakes, are we going to be loyal to our Creator?
Yep.
Or do we just plan on making mistakes and being self-centered?
Yeah, very good point, John. And we'll come back to that. I want to make sure we come back to that. We leave time for that at the end. Let's go on to the next piece of bad news. So the good news was your tribe will advance your interest at any cost. Okay. but this one's probably even a little bit more obvious. Their tribal loyalty will bring endless feuding. And again, I gave you some text there in the outline you can look up later. But this incident between Joab and Amasa, where Joab assassinates Amasa, that's the tip of the iceberg. As I think it was John Cosgrove that mentioned a minute ago, he'd already done this to Abner, and we had this family feuding and family members murdering one another back and forth. I mean, they don't have anything, the Hatfields and McCoys don't have anything over on this family. And this tribal feuding goes on and on and on. And I gave you a few passages that show you decades later how this continues on, this family feuding. And what a heritage. Yes, your family survived, but they're in living death. They have the sword hanging over them. And beyond that, your tribe, yeah, their loyalty, as good as that may be, and as much as they have your back, it also leads to this endless feuding, which is not good. So there's bad news, David. Their tribal loyalty brings endless feuding. Pretty sad. And so the good news is really tempered with some very sobering bad news. And again, I'm going to go on, but give just an opportunity. And I know I'm skipping over a lot of passages that we could be reading. Go back and look at your outline. And I gave you examples of those. Right now, I'm just referring to them. But any questions or comments about this bad news piece?
Doug, I think my point was, I was thinking, David will never live a secure life. He has just defeated the 10 tribes, and he's trying to make amends with them. They turn on him immediately through this one character here. He will never really be totally in control at night when he goes to bed.
Yes.
I mean, the damage is done. He just can't control it.
Yep.
Is he supposed to be in control? I mean, obviously not.
There's another point there. Yeah. Okay. I just got a message here. Let me just read it here. This showcases how the innocent suffer because of the guilty. The concubines were not guilty of any wrongdoing, yet are living the consequences of others' choices. Reminds me of our God. He is innocent in this war between good and evil, yet he took our penalty and high treason against his government. Yeah. Oh, you guys are coming up with rich insights. I'm going to move forward. Good stuff, but I do want to get us on to the full picture here. Let me go to the last one here. So yeah, there's good news. Your kingdom is secure. And Ken, you kind of led us into this. Your kingdom is secure from treasonous takeovers. And it's true for the rest of David's life, which was not that much longer. But for the rest of David's life, there's no more treasonous takeovers. We don't even read of any attempts. But your kingdom is a living failure. This will dog David's monarchy. This will dog his heritage indefinitely. And there's good and bad. It's not a totally bleak picture. But by and large, what we see, remember we said that the readers, the first readers of the book of Samuel, were looking at why did the monarchy fail? Because they are looking at this hundreds of years later when the monarchy has crashed and burned. And when it crashes and burns, they're asking why. And I'm just going to read one passage to you from the book of 2nd Chronicles. You might want to turn there with me. I noted this in the lesson, but it's worth taking a look at. We'll just look at this one briefly. It's the very last chapter of 2nd Chronicles, which is chapter 36. Look at 2nd Chronicles, chapter 36. 2nd Chronicles 36. And this is after many of the other tribes have already fallen, but David's tribe of Judah is still standing. They're kind of the last one standing, and they too eventually fall. And here it is in chapter 36, starting with verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them, that is David and his people, through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his word, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young men nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. That's a tragic, tragic story. This is about 500 years later. David's household for the next few centuries will live more or less as a failure. And like you said, Ken, even in his own lifetime, he's never completely secure. There is this sense of, I am living under the sword. And so, yes, good news, your family survived. Bad news, your surviving family faces living death. Yes, good news, your family will advance your interest at any cost. Your tribe will advance your interest at any cost. Bad news, their tribal loyalty brings endless feuding. Yes, good news, your kingdom is secure from treasonous takeovers. Bad news, your kingdom is a living failure. And that went on for centuries. Now that's a pretty bleak picture. And let's just pause there for a moment before we go on to the better news. And that is, remember, part of the purpose for writing of Samuel, the story that we have in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is to answer the question of people who are living after this story we just read, after the Babylonian captivity. And they're saying, what went wrong? Why did the monarchy fail? And the story says, well, let's go back to the very root. Let's go back to the first 2 kings. And we begin to see how it was rotten at the core. And that, yes, there were glimmers of goodness, but basically it was not a system that was working. And people were making decisions that were apart from God, that was turning this thing into something bad. And it's answering those questions. And so appropriately, it takes a bit of a dark tone. And it says, here's some explanation for why things are the way they are. Now, that's a pretty bleak picture if we end there. But there is better news. There is good news. And let's go to that. And I want to spend the last bit of our time looking at that good news and then applying it to ourselves. So let's go back through the same family, tribe, and kingdom. If we look at the best news, and that is, David, here's the best news. Your family will produce Jesus the Messiah. Now you say, no, wait a minute. Is that really there? Look back again at 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is a key passage in understanding this bigger story. And this is when Nathan comes to David and he says, thanks, but no thanks. You're not going to build a temple. You're not going to build a house for God, but God is going to build your house. And if you look here at this in verse 8, well, let's go back up to verse 5. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. We're in 2 Samuel 7, verse 5. This is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I've not dwelt in a house from the day that I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you've gone, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning. And I have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will give you rest from all your enemies. Now you say, that sort of happened, it sort of didn't happen. God is looking at the biggest picture here. ultimately this will happen. And it's why in the book of Revelation, Jesus is pictured as the offspring of David, bringing peace to his people forever. And he goes on to say, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. That happened in Solomon. And Solomon was, again, good and bad, but Solomon was a king of peace, and he did do much of what it says here, but he didn't do the ultimate, which Jesus would do, who would be the ultimate son of David. I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. And then dropping down to verse 16, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. How is this ultimately fulfilled? Not in Solomon, not even in Solomon's sons or grandsons. It was ultimately only fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And just to remind you of that is very scriptural, look at Luke chapter 1, where the angel is speaking to Mary. Luke chapter 1, verse 20. Luke 1, verse 20. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of a greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. The only way that 2 Samuel 7 was ever fulfilled was in the ultimate king, the Messiah, the anointed one, Jesus Christ. Now, David certainly didn't understand all of that, but he did understand that God had made a promise to him clear back before the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. And God had said, I'm going to do something, and I'm going to make sure that your throne is established forever. And he didn't quite understand all of that. And as time goes by, he probably grasped bits of it. We have the privilege of seeing how it all took place, that the best news is that David's throne is established in Jesus Christ. His family would produce Jesus, the Messiah. I'm going to go over these next points really quickly because I want to get to the application. What about his tribe? His tribe will introduce the Lion of the tribe of Judah. David is from the tribe of Judah. How is Jesus pictured throughout Scripture, especially in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 4 and 5, as the Lion of the tribe of Judah? And so here we have the tribe at all cost doing what is good for David and his people, but not without the without the treachery of the likes of Joab. And I'll just leave it at that. And then finally, your kingdom will enjoy the rule of Jesus Christ. Your kingdom will enjoy the rule of Jesus Christ. His kingdom will never end. Again, I could read the passage, but I'm not going to, of Revelation picturing Jesus taking the kingdom, all tears being wiped away, all sorrow behind us, death and disease and decay, no more. Those are all the things that were pictured in 2 Samuel 7 that David only could glimpse briefly. And it actually goes back earlier to Abraham when God says to Abraham, Abraham, I am going to bless the whole world through your offspring. Is that the Jewish nation? Yeah, partly. Is it David? Yeah, partly. Is it Jesus? Absolutely. That's the offspring of Abraham and David that has blessed the whole world, and the one who will ultimately bring all of the best news possible to us. So while we have good news, while we have bad news, the best news is that God is not going to walk away from all this bad news or even the good news. He's going to bring the best news, and the best news comes in Jesus Christ. Now, we've only got a moment left, and I want to quit sharing my screen, and as much as possible in this format, look into your eyeballs and just ask you as you consider this story. I know it's a complex, bloody story, and it has good news, it has bad news, and it has the best news. I want you to just think of your own life, and that is your own life right now, where you live it at kind of the bloody level, the bleeding edge level. Your story has good news and bad news, but it also has the best news in it. What's the good news in your story right now? What's the bad news? And what's even better than the news that you could possibly imagine? How is God wanting to take you from beyond the distraction of people's heads getting cut off or intestines gushing out and all of that gore? How is God wanting you to take you beyond that and say, there's something even better than you could imagine in your story right now? And you can't quite see it, but you can glimpse it. And I've got something better for you. I've got the best for you. And it may not be easy to see, but that best is all wrapped up in Jesus Christ. And the same way that Jesus Christ was the hope of David and the hope of Israel and the ultimate fulfillment of every promise that God made to David, that is what Jesus is to us today. And we may not be able to see it. It may not be clear to us in the moment, but that is the reality. And so I'd like you to just take a moment right now, quietly, to ask God, in the middle of whatever I am in, if it's good news, if it's bad news, if it's one of those good news, bad news sort of seasons of my life, what's the best news? How is Jesus the best news that I could possibly imagine in my life right now? Just take a moment. I'm going to give you a chance to just ask God about that. Father, I'm going to break protocol here a little bit. Usually we don't have prayer until the very, very end, but I'd like to pray right now for every person online and in the room who are contemplating right now what might be the better news, the best news in their lives. If that doesn't come to them right now, bring it to them later. May they find reason to hope in you and to see that you have something much bigger, much better for them than they could possibly imagine. And that in the middle of some really ugly, bloody stuff, you're working for something that is better than we could ever imagine. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
What an hour. What if you shut down? What would you have missed? What an hour. I just can't thank you enough. For those that are new here the first time, Doug writes our lessons every week, emails from Walla Walla. That's where he is now. If you want to get on our email list, please see me after the class. I'll get you on. We send it out every week. An incredible hour. On a lighter note, good news, bad news, and then we'll leave. We had 2 sons and we had 2 daughters. And I thought the daughters would be just like the boys, which I knew. So Judy came to me, and we were talking when the oldest daughter was about 10 or 12, and said, I can't find anything she'll wear. She won't wear this, she won't wear that. That's ridiculous. Don't take her shopping. Don't worry about it. So we went shopping at the mall. I spent about 2 hours there, and everything I would point out, I would get her, she would roll her eyes. So finally came home, and Judy said, well, how'd it go? So I got good news, bad news. Good news, we bought something. The t-shirt says this: I see your lips moving, but all I hear is blah, 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 blah. That was the bad news. So those things stick with me. Good news, bad news happens every day. Next week, we'll let you know who the teacher is, and we hope to see you all back here at 10 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for zooming in. Lucy Blue, is that a movie star?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, great news. Yeah. Bad news, good news, still together until we stop boring and start moving. Yeah. Great. Okay. We'll see you guys next week. Let me know if you can get on.